Hadn't gotten yet because they ship on the 19th. Just pre-ordered, did the pre-order. Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? And it
Hey Don, how you doing?
Oh, you did.
I'll say good.
Sing the seat for anybody? He told me that's right.
I guess it's 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. ahead and get started. I've asked Casey to start us off with a prayer. And, I was asked, and I already told Casey about it, but if you didn't see the news today, what happened in Utah, and, the violence is just out of hand, what happened recently in North Carolina. There was also a shooting in Denver at a high school today, so asked him to remember that and just the violence in general that people are starting to have around here. So,
Okay, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this day and this opportunity to get together again this evening, just to fellowship with one another and study more about your word. I pray that you be with John tonight as he brings us what he has prepared, and just pray that we will have open hearts and minds, and that you will be with him. Father, I just pray that specifically today with everything that's gone on, it's just a sad day, and I pray you be with the Kirk family at this time. I pray you be with his family, his kids, and just the tragic thing that happened today. And along with that, be with the families that were affected with the shooting in Colorado, and of course the Ukrainian girl that was murdered in the subway. There's just so much violence in this world, and I just pray that people can seek out your light, and that you can just show yourself to people that are in the dark, and that just really don't understand what you have to offer. I just pray that this country can heal and find some love, and that there will just be less hate in the world. Father, watch over us tonight and be with us through this service. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Okay, so we're going to continue on a little bit. I kind of introduced last week what I was going to talk about, and we're going to talk about the lesson that I titled, and I kind of mentioned it last time. I call it "And God Said," and is it the Big Bang or the Big Fizzle? I previously mentioned that we cannot prove that God exists. We can look at evidence. None of us were there at the beginning of creation. We don't know exactly how God did it. We know what His Word tells us He did. We know what mainstream science tells us that they believe happened. But we do not have anything but evidence to look at. And I mentioned last time, I am a young earth creationist. But there are many people who are old earth creationists or old earth evolutionists. And all we can do is look at evidence. And Proverbs 18:17 tells us, in a lawsuit, the first to speak seems right until someone comes forward and cross-examines. Now, God may have been the first to speak, but over the last many years, mainstream media and mainstream science has been the loudest to speak. And many of the scientific evidence has been pushed by the wayside because it does not fit the mainstream paradigm. Now, does everybody know what a paradigm is? Okay, so if you don't, it is your belief system. Now, someone could come today and tell me and lay down 100% undeniable proof that God doesn't exist, and I don't think I would believe them. Because my paradigm says that God does exist, God is real, God created the earth, and even if you showed me proof of it, I would probably say, no, it's fake. It doesn't, it's a trick. It doesn't fit what I believe. So oftentimes we have a hard time shifting our paradigms in going from what somebody says is true to what we know is true, and it's just difficult to change a paradigm. So, all we are doing is cross-examining what science tells us. Because like I said last week, there is a lot of science that supports young earth creationists, and it simply gets pushed by the wayside. And I'll talk about it if we have time at the end of the class, but where I get a lot of my information, I said last time, I am not an expert. I am a biologist. I have a degree in biology. I have a master's degree in biological sciences, but I am no expert. I am not a physicist. I am not a cosmologist or an astronomer. So I do a lot of reading. And some of the articles I read over the last few days, you think, well, it's off a website called Answers in Genesis. So it's obviously biased towards God. So it's going to only have, light science, not real science. Well, the person who's writing some of these articles is a Harvard-educated PhD cellular biologist. I would just about guarantee you he is a real scientist, a real biologist, and he knows what he's talking about. Yes?
Can I ask his name?
Nathan Johnson, I think. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look. But he has recently, and I'm probably going to talk about it in another lesson later, but he has recently done some research looking at DNA and tracing back the human origin, and the work he's done fits directly in to about a 6,000 year framework, and it lines up perfectly with a young Earth. It does not line up with an old like modern man's been on Earth for 1,000,000 years. It doesn't line up with that. Now, you can go on there, you can read these articles, but I will tell you that a lot of them are pretty technical, and they get bogged down with mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA and how they trace it and track it and some things like that. But it is very interesting, at least it is to me, because I work in that field in biology, and it's just very interesting to me. So, we're going to start today just by talking about origin of the universe, origin of the world, and the biblical account is very different than what mainstream science tells us. And just as a side note, one of the articles, and I actually read it today, and this physicist, or the cellular biologist, the Harvard biologist, he was asked a question: if you as a creationist are right, how come 99% of the scientists disagree with you? And he actually did some research on that, and what he found is that 99% of the scientists go to universities that only teach evolution. 1% of the scientists go to universities that teach creation and talk about evolution on the side, and he said that, obviously that fits within what causes that. If the majority of people are being taught evolution and old Earth, and they're not seeing any of the scientific evidence for young Earth and creation, then obviously their entire belief system is based on the science that says old Earth. So it was just interesting that was in there. So when it comes to the origin of the world or the origin of the universe, there are basically three types of people. Okay, there are people who accept the Bible as God's inspired word, true, authoritative, and they accept the biblical record as exactly face value what it says. There are people who have no belief whatsoever in God. They are atheists. They need a reason of how did we get here. And for them, this is it, the Big Bang. It happened naturally, nothing caused it, it's a natural phenomenon, and that's how we got here. And then we have people, they typically have the title of evolutionist, atheist, agnostic. Sometimes you might hear them referred to as free thinkers. And the third group is those who believe in God, believe in His Word, but they want to try and incorporate some of the mainstream science into the gospel account or the biblical record. And I'm not trying to say one way or the other how it did or didn't happen, because I'm not there. I wasn't there. All I can do is show evidence, and the evidence that I find, there is evidence for young Earth. There is evidence for old Earth. But the more we learn about some of this evidence, we find that some of the models of old earth stuff don't really fit. So they start adding to the model and creating new parts and adding to it to try and make it fit, because that's their paradigm. And they cannot shift their paradigm to a new way of thinking. So oftentimes these are what you might have referred to as theistic evolution or progressive creationists. So if you want to go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 1, the first thing that we're going to do is I want to look at the biblical account of creation.
John, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
In your reading, I mean, you may or may not know any kind of answer to this. Do either of those two at the bottom believe that anything is going to happen after death?
Oftentimes, theistic evolutionists, they believe in God. They believe in, that the Bible is God's inspired word. They are Christian. They just have a hard time that if science says the world is 4 billion years old, then we have to believe science, but the Bible says God created the world. So oftentimes they'll say that, yeah, God created the world, he just used evolution to do it. And he set that in motion and let it happen. So I would say the bottom group, absolutely, they believe in life after death, judgment, heaven, hell, all of that kind of stuff as well. So, Genesis 1, 3 through 5. Day 1, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. As we read through this account, I want you to notice the terms evening, morning, and a number preceding day. So it always will say there was evening, there was morning, there was the first day. Evening, morning, second day, third day. And just notice that as we read through it. So, I'm going to put it up here because I don't want to go back and forth, but day 1, light. So God created light. What did he create on day 2?
Separated the water and the sky.
Okay? So Genesis 1, 6 through 8. And God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. And it was so. God called the expanse sky. There was evening. There was morning, the second day. So, I'm just going to put waters. So does anyone have an idea or thought about what they mean when it says they separated the waters?
Created the atmosphere.
Okay. Typically, it is thought that what is happening here is the atmospheric moisture is being separated from something like a body of water. And I'm not going to say it's a globe yet, but there is a mass of water, there is sky above it, and there is atmospheric water. And we've gotten that far. So how about day 3? You can sing the song if you need to.
Land.
Okay, so we had land, and we had more than that,
Vegetation.
and we had vegetation. So Genesis 1, 9 through 13. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and plants bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And just as a side note, because I kind of, as a biologist, I find it interesting that he talks about seed-bearing plants and their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it. So there's two types of plants. You have gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms produce seed on the outside. Angiosperms produce seed, it means in a vessel, and they produce seed inside a fruit. And here we are, Genesis 1, where Moses is writing this down, and he's distinguishing two plant types. And later on, with seed-bearing plants, we have distinguished it and broke it into two plant types. So how about day 4? Okay. And I know my handwriting is bad, but you can probably still read it. So Genesis 1, 14 through 19. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the 4th day. Okay, how about day 5? Okay, yep, birds and fish. So Genesis 1, and I guess I need to be advancing this, huh? So there's day 3, there's the plants. Day 4, day 5. And I realize that I have the wrong team up here, but it won't let me change it because we don't have a subscription to PowerPoint. So it's the wrong team. But anyways, Genesis 1, 20 through 23. And God said, "Let the waters teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which waters teem, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the 5th day. Okay, so now we come to the actual last day of creation. And what was created? Okay, so animals, creatures that crawl upon the ground, and man. So Genesis 1, 24 through 31. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals, each according to their kind, the livestock according to their kind, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. and to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the air, and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. So, after a hard week of work, what do you like to do next? We rest. So God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. So, then we rest. Genesis 2, 1 and 3 says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." So we have the biblical account. God created the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Now, what about those other theories? What is the most common theory? I call it anti-God theory of how we got here.
It was all a big accident. Darwinism.
Yeah, it was all a big accident, Big Bang. So, can anyone just give me the very basics of what the Big Bang theory says?
A bunch of chemicals and protons and neutrons came together and exploded, and suddenly there was somehow life.
Okay, very, very close.
A singular event initiated the creation of everything we know in the universe.
Okay.
Is the big
And how old is the universe? According to the Big Bang theory.
13 billion years.
Yeah, about somewhere between 12 to 15 billion years ago. So basically it states that somewhere between 12 to 15 billion years ago, all the matter in the universe was concentrated into one extremely small, dense, very hot region that may have been about the size of a period on a piece of paper. And then for some unknown reason, the region exploded. And it's not like an explosion like when we watch an action movie and things blow up. It's basically just saying that for some unknown reason, that tiny little region suddenly expanded rapidly. And they call it the Big Bang. And it was actually called the Big Bang as a joke, but it stuck. So, and one of the results was suddenly that everything from this tiny little dot, the size of a period on a piece of paper, all of a sudden we have all the formation of the galaxies all racing away from each other. And they'll say that this explains why the universe is expanding. However, science has yet to actually prove that the universe is expanding. They say it is, but no one has proven it. Some people thought they had, and their science, after it went under review, kind of fell apart. They retracted it, and they've tried a couple times to say it is, but there's not actually been any proof of it. No one has actually been able to mathematically prove it with mathematical modeling or theoretical physics or anything like that. But you don't hear about that. So,
Comment about fine-tuning.
go ahead.
Where did the matter come from to begin with?
We're going to talk about that.
Can you comment about fine-tuning?
Not too much.
Have you considered the possibility that God was behind the Big Bang?
That's the theistic evolution side, and it's possible. I wasn't there. When he said, "Let there be light," perhaps there was this sudden expansion of light. But we're going to look at some of the problems associated with the Big Bang as how it compares to the biblical account. And I'm not talking about billions of years versus 24-hour days. We're going to talk about some of the science of it and how certain other theories don't really fit. So I'll just wait. I don't want to get too far ahead. So one of the things that all scientists agree on is that, and I got this particular information off of a pro-Big Bang Theory website. And it says that prior to that moment, there was nothing. All scientists agree there was nothing. And then during and after that moment, there was something. And the theory is, and this is word for word, the theory is an effort to explain what happened.
That doesn't make sense.
Well, but,
It takes a lot of faith to believe that.
you know, and like I say, I am not a physicist. You know, and I understand some of the basics about what they're saying, what they're talking about, but I am not a physicist. I am certainly not a theoretical physicist. And it can get very complicated. And, you know, so I'm just going to hit the highlights of what I understand and what I have read and, you know, some of the things. Another quote, and this quote came from the March 3rd, 2007 issue of New Science Journal, New Scientist. Dr. Peter Coles, he's an astrophysicist. He was interviewed and he wrote, "We don't know for sure if inflation, which is the actual expansion or Big Bang," he says, "we don't really know if it happened." He said, "We are certainly a long way from being able to identify the inflation." And then my favorite part of his quote is, "In a way, we're still as confused as ever about how the universe began, but perhaps now we're confused on a higher level and for a better reason." So, you know, I mean, it sounds to me like he's being honest, and he's saying, we don't really know what we're talking about, but we're still going to teach it like it's a fact. We're going to teach your kids like it's a fact, even though it's a theory and we don't really know for sure, but we're going to teach it like fact. So,
What I've noticed about the academics is that they use science as a loaded term, but it actually means we philosophize.
you know, I mean, some science is undeniable science. Some things, you know, I read an article today, and I only kind of skimmed through it, so I don't remember the particulars about it, but it said evolution is proven. And when you go in and read the article, so evolution can mean different things depending on how you define it. And they didn't specifically define it, but by the way they were talking about it was the theories and principles behind how evolution would work have been shown to be proven, but nothing has been proven as to whether or not it actually occurred. So it depends on how you define it. And we're going to look at how they define nothing in a little bit. So some of the problems that are associated with the Big Bang is, it was asked a while ago, where did the original material come from? So there are different theories on that. One is that it is a cyclic universe. The matter has always been there, and it just explodes, and they have what's called the Big Bang and the Big Crunch. It explodes, it collapses. It explodes, it collapses. And it's been doing it over and over, and will continue to do it over and over for all eternity. That has been losing favor. We'll talk more about it later, but the laws of entropy say that it really can't happen. So this is beginning to lose a lot of favor. It's not as widely considered anymore. So, you know, scientists agree, before the Big Bang, there was nothing. There was no space, no time, nothing. So if there was nothing, how did everything appear from nothing? You know, because we talked a little bit about last week, the first law of thermodynamics says you cannot create matter from nothing. But that's what they're saying happened with the Big Bang Theory. You know, and we told the story of Flatland, where for that two-dimensional man, suddenly matter appeared in his living room, but it was actually a third-dimensional being crossing his plane of existence. And we all know that God exists on a much higher plane than we do. And the laws of thermodynamics may tell us that you can't create or destroy matter, but for God, He's not bound by those laws, and He can do whatever He wants, and it defies our logic and understanding of science and how it works. So, some people will say that that matter has just always been there, but it really doesn't fit. It doesn't fit what mainstream science tells us even. So others will say that energy and matter just happen to create itself out of coincidence.
Then you have to exist before yourself in order to create yourself.
Yeah. There
It's
is,
not a contradiction.
it's not a big theory, but there is a theory that a couple of different dimensions accidentally collided and it caused it. But there is no way anybody is ever going to prove something like that. And personally, to me, it seems like they're just grasping for straws to explain it. But there's no evidence, there's no anything behind it. You know,
That just puts the problem a step farther. You still have the
Yeah.
same problem.
you do.
That material, you can't take it.
Yeah.
It's incompatible with material universe to have eternal because they're contradictory.
Yeah.
Eternal and matter are contradictory.
You know, like I say, there are problems, and I'm only going to talk about some of them because there are others that I would probably need a couple of hours to explain what they mean, and I might need a couple of weeks to figure out what they mean before I can explain it. So, you know, we talked briefly last week that our universe is governed by certain laws. In Job 38:33, God asked Job, "Do you know the laws of the heaven, and can you set up their dominion over the earth?" You know, God knows the laws, and He can set them up because He created them. So He understands things about it, you know, that we will never understand. I took a class in college called Biology Through the Eyes of Faith. And if you think of all knowledge on earth like a big funnel, God is up here. We are down here. And God understands so much more than we do that truthfully, we're probably never going to be up here. And we're never going to understand exactly how God did things the way He did, how it worked. And you know, to some degree, or to all degree, that's where our faith comes in. You know, and we don't want blind faith. You know, the Bible tells us to add knowledge, to our goodness, add knowledge. We are to add knowledge. You know, in the Apostle John said he wrote these things down so that you may believe. So nobody's being asked to just take a blind leap of faith. Jesus didn't come to earth and say, "Trust me, I'm the Son of God." He did things, He showed them, He gave them evidence, and they had to draw the conclusion themselves. And, you know, we're trying to look at knowledge that is out there, but we are not told that knowledge because most of the people who are teaching us don't necessarily believe what we believe. And they don't want us to know that creation scientifically is possible because it disrupts their entire way of life and their entire career and education and everything they have worked for forever. So, but these laws, you know, we know gravity. We call it a law because gravity works the same way every place in the universe, as far as we know. There may be areas that have low gravity. There may be areas that have no gravity. But gravity still works the same here on Earth as it does on the moon, on Mars, wherever. Gravity works the same. If gravity didn't work the same every single time, we couldn't trust it. If certain laws were not laws, we could not trust them because our results for our scientific experiments would be different every single time. It'd just be what kind of mood are the laws of the universe in today. So, in some of these laws, and we've talked a little bit about it, there's 4 laws of thermodynamics. We're only going to talk about 2 of them. But these are the big laws. These are the laws that really, you cannot violate these laws, because if you violate these laws, then none of the other laws really matter. You know, these are kind of like the do not murder laws of science. So, the first law of thermodynamics, you know, the second law we didn't really talk about much, but it says that energy and matter are transformed from more orderly to less orderly. You know, so we have matter, we have a tree. What can you do with a tree, and what can a tree do? produces oxygen. Certain trees can produce fruit, food.
Scrubs carbon dioxide.
Yeah, it pulls carbon dioxide out of the air, pulls certain nutrients up out of the soil and gets them into fruit that we can eat and get into our bodies. You can cut it down and build things out of it. You can grind up the wood and make paper. Trees are very, very useful. If I burn the tree into a pile of ash, did I destroy the matter? No. First law of thermodynamics is I just transformed it. I transformed it into heat energy, smoke particles, and ash. What can I do with those? I can use the ash for fertilizer.
Generate electricity.
Yeah, from the heat. But you see how the part of the matter that I produced by burning it is less useful overall than what you can do with the tree. The tree has way more uses than the heat, the smoke, and the ash. And so I went from more orderly matter, I transformed it to another form, and now it's a little bit less useful. And that second law of thermodynamics is what we call the law of entropy. Everything in the universe is winding down. So, how many of you own a car that's going to last forever? Or a hot water heater that will never wear out? How many of you can clean a room in your house, shut the door, come back 10 years later, and it's just as spotless as when you left? Why not? And everything is winding down. Why can't we stay young forever? Everything is winding down. You know, if we don't put more energy into our system, we die pretty quick. We starve to death. But even though we continually put new energy and new nutrients into our system, our bodies still wind down. We get older, our cells are constantly dividing, little mistakes happen, some cells are less efficient, some cells die out, and we age. And that second law of thermodynamics, that law of entropy, is just telling us that everything is winding down. But evolution tells us that everything should become more advanced and more systematic and more orderly. But the laws of the universe say it goes the other way, and everything is winding down. So, and one of the arguments has been, well, that's in a closed system. And our universe is an open system because we have things from other dimensions coming in. But even if you do, our bodies are open systems, and we are constantly putting in new inputs and new energy, but we still wind down because overall the law of entropy is still going to take effect. So the earth cannot, or the universe cannot explode and contract, because eventually it would wind down. So it can't go on forever, all eternity. It can't have been going on for all eternity because unless there is something out there to rewind the system. And we don't know of anything unless God is rewinding the system. So the Big Bang is beginning to lose popularity. I mentioned last time, it's kind of being replaced with string theory, which really isn't a new Big Bang theory. It's just saying that instead of one big expansion, we have a whole bunch of little subatomic expansions, and those little expansions are happening in what they call strings. So some other theories, in 1973, and you're going to think this is preposterous, but in 1973, Francis Crick and Leslie Orgel published a paper called Directed Panspermia. And he's basically saying his theory is that aliens came from another planet and seeded the Earth with genetic material and many other planets in order to try and propagate and spread life through the universe. And that just kicks it down the road again, because where did that life originate from? You know, so, and believe it or not, that Crick and Orgel is kind of beginning to gain a little bit of popularity again, because the Big Bang Theory is not holding up to some of the science. And a lot of times they'll say, well, it's just because we haven't learned enough yet. The problem is the more we learn, the more we realize that they were wrong. So at what point is that going to reverse, that we finally learned enough that all the stuff we were wrong about we're now correct about? And it's just not going to work that way. So, and I said it last week, if you do not believe in God, how did you get here? You need an explanation. And that explanation is it had to have happened naturally, somehow, spontaneously, and that's how we got here. So, to me, Big Bang Theory really is an anti-God theory. So, some other issues that we have problems with. If the universe was condensed into a little tiny dot, it would have been super, super hot. Because the more friction you have, the more heat you get. When that expansion occurred, theoretical physics tells us that we should have had a huge amount of creation of something called monopoles. Magnets are bipolar. They have a positive and a negative pole. Monopoles are particles that only have one pole. They're either positive or they're negative poled, and they're magnetic. And they are long-living, long-lasting. They don't fizzle out real fast. So if the universe expanded rapidly and was under such intense heat, we should have monopoles everywhere. They have never been discovered. Not one single monopole has ever been found anywhere, but theoretically they should exist if the universe was created through a Big Bang type system. Another issue with it is that helium or hydrogen gets converted to helium over time. Hydrogen is the gasoline that drives the universal engine. Helium is the exhaust. If the universe has been around for 13 to 15 billion years, there should be lots of helium and not much hydrogen. But when they look, hydrogen is everywhere and helium is pretty rare. So we don't have a lot of exhaust, but we still have a lot of fuel. And there are other issues with the Big Bang theory that science doesn't support. And typically what is done is like, well, okay, that theory fell apart, so let's create multiple different parts and stick it in there and try to make it work. And they just create new mathematical models and new parts to make the theory bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, because that's the only way they can get it to work. Now, scientists still agree that before the origin there was nothing. But they're beginning to change the definition of nothing. How do you define nothing?
A lack of something.
Yeah, there's nothing there. So, do you guys know who this is? This is Michio Kaku. And he's kind of like, he's one of the originators of string theory, and he's kind of like the new Stephen Hawking. Super smart, knows a lot about it. And he was interviewed, and when he was asked the origin of the universe, he said, the probable answer is that space, time, and everything about it, lost my place, everything about the origin of the universe, he said everything around us comes from nothingness. And he was asked, so nothingness is actually filled with physical reality? And he said, oh yes, we think nothing is chock full of stuff. Then it's not nothing. So, he said nothingness is actually chock full of interactions. So if your theory doesn't, to me it says, if at first you don't succeed, create a new theory. And it's kind of what has been done with the Big Bang Theory over the years. They have continually redefined words, added to it. And this goes back to what I said at the beginning. If you have a particular paradigm, it is going to be incredibly difficult to change your belief. Because your paradigm is not just what you believe, it's part of what makes you who you are. It's your belief system that defines who you are. And to say that suddenly that's not true, any of us in this room would have a hard time changing not just what we believe, but who we are. So, if the matter that makes up the universe cannot create itself, which is the first law of thermodynamics, and it cannot be eternal, the second law of thermodynamics, how did it get here? You know, God had to have done it. You know, like I said, refer back to that story of Flatland last week. There are some things that we physically cannot understand, but for God, it's a piece of cake. You know, there is I think it's like a Confucius Buddhist saying, and it kind of tries to challenge the power of God. And it says, is God so powerful that he can make a rock so big that he cannot move it? And I would tell you, yes, he can, and he would still move it, and it would defy our understanding of the laws of physics. Because he created those physics, and he could make a rock so big that he wouldn't be able to move it, but then he would still be able to move it, and it would blow our mind to see how it was done, because he set up the laws of the universe, and he is not bound by those laws. So things that seem impossible to us are just very matter-of-fact, simple for God. Now, if you remember, in the beginning, I said we have three types of people. Those who believe the Bible at face value, those who don't believe in God at all, and then we have people that, you know, we call it theistic evolutionists or progressive creationists. So this third group is trying very hard to make evolutionary theory time frame fit within the biblical creation account. So one of the theories is called day-age theory, and another one is called gap theory. Day-age theory is saying that, okay, yes, God created the heavens and the earth, but each day was an age. And those days, you know, day one, when he created the light, was really, you know, 1 billion years. And day two was 1 billion years. And that's why our geology and our science says that, you know, the earth is 4.5 billion years old, which we're going to talk about in another lesson. So the gap theory says that on day one, God created light. And then there was like 1 billion years between day one and day two. And then on day two, God created the waters. And then there was 1 billion years in between day 2 and 3. And then he created land. So they're basically the same theory. It's just one day-age theory says that each day was a long age. And gap theory says that each day was a literal 24-hour day, but there were huge periods of time in between each day. So basically both theories, you know, suggest that creation really took a long period of time. Now, could God have done that? He could have. I'm not saying he couldn't. I'm not saying he didn't. But he's certainly capable of doing that. But we have to look at evidence. That's all we can do is look at evidence. So these particular theories are coming from, you know, Bible verses like 2 Peter 3:8. With the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. So, what is that Bible verse talking about? Okay? Yeah, it's talking about God's patience. You know, with anything we read in the Bible, we can't just pick out a verse and say, oh, that's what it says, I can do it, I can do that. We've got to look at context, we've got to look at what's being talked about, and, you know, if we read more, we read on in 3:9, 2 Peter 3:9, it says, the Lord is not slow in keeping his promises, as some understand slowness. You know, he's not talking about how long it took creation. If I say you are as slow as molasses, are you literally molasses? I mean, I said you were as slow as molasses, so you must be literal molasses. But we're still human beings, and just because you say something a certain way, it doesn't necessarily imply. we're talking about how patient God is. He is so patient that he's willing, whether it takes a day or 1,000 years, he's going to wait because he wants none to perish. These particular verses are not talking about how long it took him to create creation. So we also see, in Job 10:5, Job is speaking to God and he says, "Are your days like those of a mortal, or are your years like those of a man?" Well, our time is limited, God's is not. It's not particularly saying that time moves slower for God. Time moves faster for us because we're mortal and we're men. That's not what it's talking about. So we have to remember that at this point, Job feels like he's been unjustly punished by God. Job is saying that God is not like a mortal man, and he understands more. So he understands that Job didn't do anything. Job is saying, I didn't do anything to deserve this punishment. And if we read on through other verses in Job, later God asks Job in 38:2, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge?" Saying, Job, you don't know what you're talking about. And in Job 42:3, Job himself admits, "Surely that I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know." So these particular verses are not talking about how long it took God to create the heavens and the earth. These are talking about different topics. So these particular things just don't, we like to, people like to say, don't judge me or you'll be judged. They don't like to finish the verse that says, you'll be judged by the measure with which you judge others. So why do we have these combined theories? Some Bible believers accept as fact most of the evolutionary theory. Science tells us this is what it is. Therefore, it must be true. But God said this, so we got to combine these theories and make the science match what God said. So that's one of the reasons over the next few weeks we're going to look at what some of the actual real science says. So, these people are trying to find a way to accommodate the Genesis record into the evolutionary scenario, which evolutionary scenario, we are taught that the earth and the universe are ancient. But is that really what the science shows us? Because that's what we're going to really start looking at next week, is what does the science actually say? Is there scientific evidence that says the earth is really only about 6,000 or 7,000 years old? And we're going to talk about it, and I'm going to show you that there is evidence that suggests that. So some of the Bible believers who, they don't particularly believe in evolution. They don't believe that we evolved from, there's a book called From Goo to God, and they don't believe that we evolved from goo to God, to what we are today. But they believe in uniformitarian dating, radiocarbon dating, radiometric dating. I dated this rock and it says that this rock is 4 billion years old. But there are 64 different dating techniques, and I guarantee you get 64 different answers when you test that rock based on what technique you use. So, we have radioisotopic dating, carbon-14 dating. We were all taught that the rate of radioactive decay is constant. They've actually been having research that has been showing that as time has gone on, rates of radioactive decay may actually be slowing down. They've also been showing that when temperatures get cold and during solar flare activity, radioactive decay increases and slows down based on solar flare activity and temperatures. So imagine if your watch just randomly sped up, slowed down, sped up, slowed down. What time is it? I have no idea, because you don't know how long your watch ran fast and how long it ran slow. And when they found these results, they said, no, we made a mistake. Let's run them again. They got the same results. They thought they had made a mistake, but it turned out that radioactive decay rates maybe aren't necessarily constant like they thought they were. So one of the problems with this type of combined belief is it easily becomes much more about what does science say and a little bit less about what does the Bible say. You know, what are you going to trust more? What does the Bible say? What does science say? And a lot of times we say, well, you know, science tells us this, and we heard it all through COVID. You got to follow the science. You got to follow the science. And here we are 5 years later where they're beginning to say, you know what, we might have made a few mistakes on that. So we need to trust what the Bible says mostly. Now, some problems with day-age theory. You know, we got to look, that's why I wrote it up here, because we got to look back at the Bible account. So we need to look at what did God say, the original Hebrew. One of the things I wanted you to look at, which I know it's getting a little crowded up here, but the Hebrew word yom is the word for day. It also can mean a length of time. So if we say in the day of Noah, we might be talking about his whole lifespan. But you remember in the beginning I said pay attention to when we have the word, there was evening, there was morning, you know, first day, second day. The man who was studying this, he sent this out to 4 different Hebrew scholars, and he wanted to ask them, does this mean long periods of time? What does it mean? And he didn't tell them why he was asking. He just sent it out and asked them, gave examples of what he was talking about. 3 of the 4 replied, and all 3 of them said, every single time you have the word yom, and you have evening and morning, and then a number preceding yom, he said it always means a literal 24-hour day. So, if God wanted to tell you that he created the heavens and the earth in 7 24-hour days, what language would he use? Yeah, he would use the language that he wrote in Genesis. On the first day I did this. On the second day I did this. Now, so yom can mean a long period of time, but the way it's written in Hebrew in the Genesis account, it always means a literal 24-hour day. So the way it was written, it is not implying a long period of time. It is implying a literal 24-hour day. Every single time that it's used in the way it's used. Now, there are certain contexts where you're maybe using prophetic language, and in prophetic language, yom can also mean long periods of time. But the way it's used in the Genesis account, it always means a literal 24 hours. And it's used this way more than 100 times in the Bible. So, but let's just say that, let's disregard that evidence, and let's just say that yom does mean a long period of time. If the days are interpreted as ages, then what are the nights, seasons, and years in Genesis 1:14? Because he said that, you know, he created the sun and the moon and the stars to distinguish the nights, the seasons, and the years. So if yom is a long period of age, then what do they mean here? So
before the sun and the moon and the stars were created, how long was a day?
Don't know.
That's the same question I had. How can we have morning and evening without the sun?
Right. You know,
It's consistent throughout there. You go to Exodus 20 chapter, fourth commandment. It says the same thing. We commemorate the sixth day of creation with the 7th day with a 24-hour day. How is it any different from 20 when you go back to chapter 1? And number 2, there are some scientific facts here, like how about the photosynthetic?
well, we're going to talk about that. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Don't steal my thunder. You know, so like I said, if God wanted to tell you how he did it in a literal 24 hours, 6 days, he'd use the language he used. You know, and again, what was just being alluded to, what day were plants created on? How do plants produce energy? Photosynthesis. If there was billions of years between the production of vegetation and the sun, how did these plants survive and photosynthesize during that time frame before the sun was created? So also, how do most plants reproduce? Pollination. The pollinators weren't created till day 6. So now we're talking several billion years before the pollinators were produced. So, we have the sun that wasn't created until the next day. Pollinators, and there's some other things that, and I know the bell rang, but we're going to be done in just a minute. So, also in Mark 10:6, Jesus says, "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female." If this is billions of years, is day 6 closer to the beginning of creation, or is 6 billion years later closer to creation? Because technically, if the universe is 13 billion years old, modern man has supposedly only been on the planet for 1 million years. So we're talking that, either Jesus lied and man was not created at the beginning of creation, or he was, and it was on day 6. Because we cannot fit day, age, or gap theory to make any of this work and the actual biblical creation. Because we don't have sun for the vegetative photosynthesis. We don't have pollinators to reproduce. And Jesus said that man was created at the beginning. Not, technically, we're at the end. And it's 6 days is a lot closer to the beginning than 6 billion years. Or actually 13 billion years. Why is the age of the earth important?
To me, it really isn't.
Okay.
But if we're to have faith in this book, and if we're to have faith in God, that's where the importance of earth comes in, or the age of the earth. Because it all speaks to and informs our faith.
Yeah. Everyone agrees that without vast amounts of time, evolution is not possible. We could not have evolved from goo to where we are now without billions of years. And even still, they're sometimes looking at things and saying even billions of years isn't enough because of the complexities at how it's working, that even billions of years would not have been long enough. I've been toying, I've never done this lesson, but I've been putting one together in my mind over the last few weeks and calling it "We Are Fearfully and Wonderfully Made," and looking at some of the complexities within the human body. And there is no way that just happened by accident. I just don't believe it. I don't believe it's possible. But we'll look at another lesson later when we talk about Noah's flood, and we'll look at geologic layers and whether or not the earth really is billions of years old, or does some of the geologic evidence suggest that it's maybe only a few thousand years old. And it's some pretty interesting stuff. But I said it at the beginning, some of the places that I've been getting my information, sometimes I read pro-evolution websites because I want to see where they're coming from. But I also look at Apologetics Press, Answers in Genesis. There's one called Bible Creation. There's, The Lost World. There's actually a Church of Christ in California that has a website called Saint.com, and it is S8INT.com. I would say be a little bit leery about some of the stuff you read, because some of it's just kind of written by people, not necessarily people with a scientific background. But you can chase down a rabbit hole on that website, and there are literally thousands of links that can take you to what are called OOPS artifacts that we'll talk about in one of the classes, and different things like that. But there's a lot of information out there. It's just not taught in school. You know, and one of the things, like maybe the actual age of the earth really doesn't matter, but whether or not God created it does. Because if we want to try and fit his creation story into what science says, then basically we're proving that the Bible's a lie. Because some of the time frames, you know, Big Bang Theory says that Earth was created many billions of years after the sun, moon, and stars. But the Bible says land was created before sun, moon, and stars. And if that's not true, then it's a lie. And if it's a lie, what else is a lie? You know, I don't think any of it's a lie, and that's why I say we're going to look at scientific evidence that actually supports this account as well. The scientific evidence that you just don't ever get taught. So, any questions? I blew your mind, right?
Lots of questions.
All right, well, that's all I have, and we'll talk about a little bit. We're going to kind of continue from this, move right on into something else that's very similar with this next week.